Hello, welcome to a Team SNG deck profile. Today we are going to be doing the much awaited update for Fallen of Albaz Pure, or Albaz OTK as I like to call it. While I got your attention, I'd like to ask you guys, leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. Make sure you hit that bell icon so you don't miss future decks, such as the update to Spraying's Albaz coming out next week. This deck really is a going second deck. The whole aim of it is to OTK your opponent by using Fallen of Albaz, which is a super poly on legs, to fuse off a Kaiju or a Nibiru token that you give your opponent. I've already alluded to some of the things in the deck, and so there's no point in continuing to beat around the bush. Let's just get into it. Starting off with our monsters, the first and most important monster in the deck is 3 copies of our Dragon Boy, Fallen of Albaz. As I've stated, he is a super poly on legs. When he is normal or special summoned, you discard a card from your hand, and you fuse him and 1 card on your opponent's side of the field off into one of your fusion monsters in your extra deck. There are several fusion monsters in your extra deck that specifically utilize Fallen of Albaz as material, which is basically the way that we OTK. We give our opponent something that we then quickly take away and replace with something very strong for us. One of the things we can potentially give our opponent is, well, a Nibiru token. This lets us go second because if our opponent starts building a board and starts to pop off, well, Nibiru is a very nice little hand trap that we can utilize to not only give ourselves a 3000 attack beater, but also give our opponents a token that we can instantly take away utilizing a couple of the different fusions that Fallen of Albaz has access to. Some other things we can give our opponents are, well, Kaijus. So we run a Dogorong and a Gdolarla. These are level 8s, and that's important because it means that they are suitable material for one of our Albaz fusions. You'll special summon it on the turn you fuse it away, which also means it is suitable for another one of our Albaz fusions. And finally, they both have over 2500 attack, making them both suitable for our third Albaz fusion. So these are really useful options as Kaijus due to the fact that they will be suitable for not 1, not 2, but 3 of our Albaz fusions that we run in our extra deck. To go with them, we also run 2 copies of Thunder King the Lightning Strike Kaiju and 2 copies of Jizukuru the Star Destroying Kaiju. These are definitely the better Kaijus, and the reason for that is they are suitable for all 4 Albaz specific fusions. So these are definitely the optimal Kaijus to have, which is why we run 2 of each. But the nice thing about Dogorong and Gdolarla is because they're level 8, they can also act as trade-in fodder if we have them in our hands and we need to just draw and haven't maybe seen our Fallen of Albaz already. So that does it for our Kaijus that we're going to want to fuse off our opponent's field with Fallen of Albaz. But as I stated, the deck really does rely on seeing one of your copies of Fallen of Albaz, so we need some draw power. And part of the way we facilitate that is, well, we run the typical Nessie, Tsuchinoko, and Jackalope package because they're all pluses. They're useful for their effects, which turns them into upstart goblins. They're not really something we want on the field, but it's not the end of the world because having bodies on the field can also help facilitate an OTK if we don't have one in our opening hand. We also run 2 copies of Bigfoot because when he's discarded, taking stuff off your opponent's field can always be really nice. We run 2 copies of Thunderbird because, again, taking stuff off our opponent's field can be nice. And we also finally run 2 copies of Danger Mothman because this at least lets us dig into our deck a little further, whether it gets sent or it gets summoned. So these are all here to facilitate the ability to draw into one of our Fallen of Albazes. That does it for our monsters. Onto our spell traps. With the release of Lightning Overdrive, Fallen of Albaz got some extra support. The first spell that he got was Branded in White. I run this at 3 with this deck because it just is a fusion spell for Fallen of Albaz. It lets you utilize him and a monster on your side of the field or in your hand as material to fusion summon a fusion monster from your extra deck. Now, you don't have to use him, and you don't have to fusion summon an Albaz fusion, but realistically, you're going to want to, because what this lets you do if you're summoning a Fallen of Albaz fusion is use materials from your graveyard instead by banishing them, or from your hand or from your field. So it just gives you extra access if you're going into an Albaz Fusion. The other thing this does is if this card is sent from the hand to the grave as cost for a Fallen of Albaz effect, then you can set this card to the field at the end of the turn. Now, since the deck is so reliant on Fallen of Albaz, I decided 3 copies wasn't enough. 3 copies of Fusion Deployment. Fusion Deployment is really, really good in this deck. What it lets you do is reveal a fusion monster in your extra deck, and then special summon from your deck or your hand a monster that is specifically listed on it. Meaning you can reveal any of your Fallen of Albaz fusions and special summon Fallen of Albaz from the deck. That will then trigger Fallen of Albaz effect, letting you discard a card and fusion summon using him and a card on your opponent's field. So, Fusion Deployment, definitely an extremely useful card to have, just because it means we're running not 3, but 6 copies of Fallen of Albaz. Now, the big weakness Fallen of Albaz himself has is that, well, he's negatable. So, why not run the original Super Poly? This way, if you're worried that your opponent's got a negate on field, you can use Super Poly instead of Fallen of Albaz, just to make sure that that fusion summon does in fact go through. Now, the best OTK this deck has access to is actually Fallen of Albaz and Interrupted Kaiju Slumber. This is facilitated by the new Fallen of Albaz fusion that we got in Lightning Overdrive. But basically, Interrupted Kaiju Slumber and Fallen of Albaz is an OTK. Now, as I've stated a few times, we're reliant on Fallen of Albaz. So, we need to be sure we see him. And with the danger package we're running, Allure of Darkness is relatively safe for us. But we're also running a ton of level 8s, not only in our danger package, but with our Kaijus too, making trade-in also a viable option. So we're running 6 draw cards, just so we can guarantee that we see either a Fusion Deployment or a Fallen of Albaz. Finally, we are running a few traps. We're running a couple copies of Judgment of the Branded. This is one of the new Fallen of Albaz traps. What it lets you do is target a level 8 or higher fusion monster that you control, and then destroy all monsters your opponent controls who have equal or higher attack. Meaning that what you can do is, if you've got this on the field, and you didn't manage to OTK, you can target one of your Albaz fusions, and then blow up anything that would be able to destroy it by battle, protecting it for now. The other thing we run is 2 copies of Screams of the Branded. If a fusion monster is sent to the graveyard, on the turn you activate this card, you can actually special summon a fusion monster from your graveyard or from Banish. Meaning that you can have your fusion monster float into a fusion monster, which can sometimes be really useful depending on what you're going to float into or what fusion monster was destroyed. Finally, both of these cards have the same effect as Branded in the white, in that if they are used for the effect of Fallen of Albaz, you can set them to the field during the end phase. So, realistically, the ideal situation is that you're going to pitch one of these for the cost of Fallen of Albaz, because then you don't lose anything, and you get these for the follow-up plays if your opponent manages to stop your OTK somehow. That does it for our main deck. Onto the extra deck. So, we are running a lot of Fallen of Albaz fusions in this deck. First off, we are running 2 copies of the new Albion the Branded Dragon. What Albion requires is a light monster and Fallen of Albaz, hence the reason we run Jizukuru and Thunderstrike at 2, because they are light. Also, the Nibiru token will be light, so now we are running 3 different monsters we can put on our opponent's field that will be light and take stuff away from our opponent. If this card is fusion summoned, you can fusion summon a level 8 or lower monster from your extra deck by banishing materials from your hand, field, or graveyard. And the way that this works with our OTK is, say you've got Nibiru on your field, you can fuse away the Nibiru token with Fallen of Albaz, go into Albion the Branded Dragon, which will put your Fallen of Albaz in your graveyard. Then you can banish your Fallen of Albaz and any other monster, whether it be in your hand or in your graveyard, and that will then let you summon out another Fallen of Albaz Fusion, which, guess what guys, they all have 2500 attack. Then you go into your battle phase and you attack for 5500 plus 2500. That's the 8000 you need to win game right there. So that's how this OTK is facilitated by the new Albion the Branded Dragon. Albion also has an effect when it's engraved during the end phase, which is that it can let you set a branded spell or trap from your deck directly to the field. You can set your Screams of the Branded, your Judgment of the Branded, or your Branded in white. Next, we run the big beater of the Fallen of Albaz lineup in Titaniclad. Titaniclad is a great card. He gets 100 points for every level of the monster used as material for him. So if you use Fallen of Albaz and the Nibiru token, he's gaining 1500 attack. The other thing he has going for him is that when he's sent to grave, you can special summon from your deck a Fallen of Albaz. So he'll float into another Fallen of Albaz fusion if your opponent destroys him on their turn. Next, we run 2 copies of Brygran the Glory Dragon. This card can't be destroyed by battle, which again, it can be really useful in specific matchups. And again, he will float into a Fallen of Albaz during the end phase he's sent to the grave. Finally, for the last of the Fallen of Albaz fusions that specifically list him as material, we run 2 copies of Sprint the Iron Dash Dragon. This is a nice card because it's effectively a Tiametan on legs that you can maneuver around. So what it lets you do is blow up everything in a column, and then you can also move it to another column. So you can choose what you're blowing up, which can sometimes be useful if you're in an awkward situation. And again, he will float into a Fallen of Albaz. The final Fallen of Albaz fusion that everyone speculates is part of the Fallen of Albaz lore, but I'm not quite so sold, is Mysterion the Dragon Crown. And the reason I'm not sold on him as being a Fallen of Albaz fusion is A, he doesn't list Fallen of Albaz as a material. And B, while it's in a very similar art style, it doesn't seem to fit into the lore that's been set up in the other decks that feature Fallen of Albaz. This card's got a few interesting protections. When it is on the field, it cannot be used as fusion material, so you do need to be a bit aware of that. But it's also nice if you run into an opponent that's going to try and fuse it off, because they can't get rid of it. This card also loses 100 attack for each of your banished cards, although you're not typically going to have too many banished cards. So what this does is it basically punishes your opponent for special summoning monsters of a single type. Meaning if you end up against a uni-type deck, and your opponent uses an effect on field to special summon another monster from their deck, what you can do is activate this, and then you can banish one monster and then banish all the monsters of that type. Which, again, for your opponent can be really detrimental. Now, if you're playing against an opponent using dragons, that can be risky for you too, because it doesn't just banish monsters your opponent controls, it will banish your dragons as well. And seeing as roughly half of your extra deck is dragons, that could be risky. The one thing I will say about Mysterion, though, is he's only useful in specific matchups, because he requires a spellcaster and a dragon. Fallen of Albaz fits the dragon, but he's only going to be useful in matchups where your opponent has a spellcaster. The reason I like this, though, is it is technically an out to Red Eye's Dark Dragoon. You can fusion summon him using Fallen of Albaz and your opponent's Dragoon. That does it for our Fallen of Albaz fusions. Now, I mentioned earlier we run Verte Anaconda. Sometimes we just need to see Super Poly, and Verte is a good way of getting there. We also run a few generic Super Poly targets in Starving Venom Fusion and Triffa Vertum, just useful if you end up against dark matchups. We also, if we end up against zombies or Zombie World, we can go into Dragon Necro, Nether Soul Dragon. And finally, if we end up against a dragon-themed deck that runs any Dark Dragons, we could use Albaz and the Dark Dragon to go into Borreload Furious Dragon. So we have a few options here just to help punish our opponents for, well, running whatever it is they want to run. Specifically dark stuff for the most part, but zombies as well. They can sometimes be a bit pesky. So that does it for the extra deck. So I've liked this deck for a long time. Its ability to OTK has always been quite apparent to me. Now that Fallen of Albaz has got himself some additional support and a few new friends, it can OTK more consistently. That, coupled with the fact we're now running 6 copies rather than 3, is also really nice. Being able to see Fallen of Albaz has always been the weakness of this deck. Now we're running so many copies of him, we should see him quite easily. Also, being able to use him to fuse stuff off from our own field has also been a bit of a limitation until now. With Branded in White being available to us, we can now fusion summon using Fallen of Albaz on our field, in our hand, or in our graveyard. He brings himself an eclectic group of fusion monsters that he can utilize as well. What with our Albion letting us bring out not only itself, but another friend, such as Titaniclad, Brygrand, or even Sprind, means that decisions are all ours. And we're not only facilitating this with Fallen of Albaz, but we're facilitating this with the cards we offer our opponent. Any of these 3 can give us access to all of Albaz's fusions. And at the end of the day, if you really need to punish your opponent, well, Interrupted Kaiju Slumber and our best Dragon Boy, Fallen of Albaz, that's an OTK right there. That being said, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Make sure you leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. Check out the test hands for this deck profile, which will be featured later this week, and is linked down below in the description. And I will see you all at the next video.